You know that moment when someone you've loved your entire life shatters your image of them in a single sentence? That was me, standing there in a dress I'd bought just for his big night, smiling through gritted teeth at my father's retirement party, while he publicly cut me down in front of everyone. Before I tell you exactly how that night went, stay with me till the end. If this story makes you feel something, anger, sadness, or even a little satisfaction, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The country club was buzzing that evening. Waiters moved between tables with champagne. The air smelled faintly of roasted beef and expensive perfume. My father, Richard Hayes, stood at the head of the room, shaking hands, laughing, soaking in the praise like he was the king of the town. Everyone knew him as the charming, successful man who built a career people admired. When it was time for his speech, I leaned forward, expecting the usual stories, thanks, maybe even a kind word for me and my brother. He went down the list of names, old friends, business partners, my younger brother Daniel, who followed him into corporate finance. Everyone got a glowing tribute. Then he looked at me. For a moment, I thought he might actually say something heartfelt. Instead, he smiled that fake little smile and said, "And there's my daughter, Emily, still single, still jumping between hobbies like she's allergic to success." The room gave this awkward, hesitant laugh. I felt every eye on me. My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile, clapping politely like it didn't slice through me. Inside, my chest was tight, my stomach twisting. It wasn't just a joke. It was a reminder to everyone in the room that in his eyes, I would never be enough. I sat there, nodding, pretending I didn't care. But I cared, more than I wanted to admit. I thought about all the times he dismissed my bakery, calling it playing shop, or the time he skipped my grand opening for a golf weekend. The time he borrowed money and never paid it back. The way he only called when he needed me to cater something for free. That one sentence in his speech wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. And for the first time, as I stared at him soaking in the applause, I realized I wasn't going to just swallow it anymore. The party went on, laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. But I barely heard it. My mind was already somewhere else, on a dusty folder in my home office, filled with documents I'd found years ago. Proof of the shady deals he thought no one knew about. I didn't know it then, but that was the night I decided I wasn't just his daughter anymore. I was going to be the one person he couldn't charm his way past, and he'd never see it coming. My father had always been a man who cared about how things looked from the outside. Prestige, status, appearances, that was his holy trinity. If something didn't fit into that perfect image he liked to present, he pushed it aside like it didn't exist. Unfortunately for me, I never quite fit his picture-perfect vision. My younger brother Daniel did. At 28, he was everything my father wanted in a child. He wore sharp suits, spoke in boardroom lingo, and followed Dad into corporate finance without hesitation. They played golf together, went to business dinners, and even had the same slick-back hairstyle. To the outside world, they were the dynamic father-son duo. Then there was me, 31, stubborn, and unwilling to mold myself into what he wanted. I'd chosen to open a small bakery and catering business because baking wasn't just a hobby for me. It was where I felt alive. The smell of cinnamon rolls at dawn, the hum of mixers, the quiet satisfaction of seeing someone's face light up when they took a bite. That was my kind of success. But to my father, it was playing shop. He said it often, like it was a harmless joke. "When you're ready to get a real job, we'll talk," he'd say with that dismissive smirk. Every time, it chipped away at me. The worst part was the way he showed up only when it suited him. When I had my bakery's grand opening, I spent weeks preparing, scrubbing floors, testing recipes until my hands ached. I sent him an invitation, hoping maybe, just maybe, he'd be proud. The day came, the place was buzzing with customers, and he was nowhere in sight. Later, he told me he couldn't make it because of a business trip. A month later, I found out it wasn't a trip at all. It was a golf weekend with his friends. Then there were the times he used me as free labor. He'd call, asking if I could help out at a corporate event. I'd show up with trays of pastries, stay late arranging food, clean up afterward, only to watch him thank the catering company he'd hired for the other half of the menu. My name never came up. Not once. And the money, how could I forget that? One afternoon he called, saying he needed a small loan, just until payday. He made it sound urgent, so I gave him what I could, telling myself it was temporary. That was 3 years ago. I never saw that money again. Whenever I brought it up, he'd change the subject or laugh it off like it didn't matter. So when he stood there at his retirement dinner, telling the room I couldn't stick to anything, I knew it wasn't just a casual jab. It was the same old story, him reminding me I would never measure up in his world. Only this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. Not anymore. The moment the speeches ended and people began drifting toward the dessert table, I felt like my chest couldn't hold any more air. The room was suddenly too small, too loud, too full of eyes that had just watched me get humiliated. I slipped out through the side door of the country club, the cool night air hitting me like a bucket of water. I leaned against a brick pillar in the parking lot, letting the chatter and music fade behind. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the burn of every word my father had just said. I kept hearing his voice, that smug little pause before he called me allergic to success, as if my worth could be summed up in a punchline. The sound of footsteps broke into my thoughts. Daniel stepped out, his hands in his pockets, his tie loosened like he was already done with the night. "Hey," he said, almost sheepish. "You know Dad's just kidding, right?" I laughed once, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Do you really believe that?" I asked. He shrugged. "That's just his way. You can't take it so personally." Of course Daniel would say that. He'd never been on the receiving end of those little cuts. Not really. Dad built him up. He tore me down. And Daniel, for all his talk about family loyalty, had never once stepped in to stop it. In that moment, something inside me clicked. It wasn't a loud, dramatic realization. It was quiet, solid, like a door locking into place. If I waited for someone else to stand up to him, I'd be waiting forever. The truth was simple. No one would ever challenge my father unless I did it myself. And then, like a slow wave, the memory hit me. 2 years ago, I'd been cleaning out some boxes in my father's old home office. He'd asked me to organize files while he was away, and I didn't think much of it until I found a folder buried under a stack of golf magazines. Inside were legal documents, contracts, and letters from a local family I vaguely remembered, the Bennetts. They'd once owned a small property my father had been after for a development deal. The papers told the story clearly. He'd pressured them into selling for far less than the land was worth, using legal loopholes and threats. The Bennetts had fought back, but in the end, they'd lost their home. The final letter from them was heartbreaking, a plea for more time, signed in shaky handwriting. At the time, I hadn't known what to do with it. He was my father, after all. I'd tucked the folder away in my own office, telling myself I'd figure it out someday. Now, standing there in the cold night air, I knew exactly what I was going to do. That someday had just arrived. The night after the retirement dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with that dusty folder spread out in front of me. The papers were yellowed at the edges, but the ink still told the same story. My father's greed written in black and white. For years, I had kept them locked away, half hoping I'd forget about them. But now, I didn't just remember. I was ready to use them. I pulled out my laptop and searched for Laura Bennett. It didn't take long to find her. Her profile picture showed a woman around my age, dark hair pulled into a ponytail, standing in front of a modest home with 2 little kids. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed out a message. "Hi Laura, you don't know me, but my name is Emily Hayes. I think we need to talk about what happened to your family years ago. I have something you might want to see." I didn't expect her to reply right away, but less than an hour later, my phone buzzed. She wanted to meet in person. The next day, we sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop. Laura's eyes were guarded, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup. "I remember your father," she said, her voice flat. "I wish I didn't." She told me how her parents had loved their home, how her dad had built the porch himself, how her mom planted roses every spring. Then my father came along, offering a deal that quickly turned into an ultimatum. When they tried to fight back, legal fees piled up. They lost the house. Her father's health took a hit from the stress, and her mother, well, Laura's voice cracked before she finished the sentence. "She's never been the same." I slid the folder across the table. "Everything's in here. Contracts, letters, proof of what he did. I'm not asking you for money, Laura. I want people to know the truth about him." She stared at the folder for a long moment before opening it. As her eyes scanned the pages, I saw her hands tremble. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because he's been hurting people for years," I said quietly, "including me, and he thinks he's untouchable." Laura hesitated. I could see the war in her expression, wanting justice, but afraid of reopening old wounds. Then she closed the folder, took a deep breath, and nodded. "All right, let's do it." We talked for hours, piecing together a plan. Richard's official corporate retirement gala was coming up next month, a bigger event than the family dinner, with all his old colleagues, clients, and media contacts in attendance. If we were going to show the truth, that would be the moment. When we finally stood to leave, Laura gripped my hand. "If we do this," she said, "there's no going back." I met her gaze without flinching. "Good. I don't want to go back." The next week, I put the first part of my plan into motion. It had to look harmless, almost sentimental, so no one would suspect what I was really building. I started by calling a few of my father's old colleagues, people he'd worked with years ago who still held him in high regard. I put on my brightest, most daughterly voice. "I'm making a surprise tribute video for Dad's corporate gala," I told them. "Something to celebrate his career, all the lives he's touched." They were thrilled. One former coworker offered me stacks of old photos. Another sent me video clips of my father giving speeches at charity events. I thanked them sweetly, acting like this was a labor of love. In a way, it was just not the kind they thought. Meanwhile, Laura went to work on her end. She reached out to people who had been burned by my father's deals. Former employees he'd underpaid, small business owners he'd pushed out, families who'd lost home. Some were hesitant to talk, afraid of his influence, but a surprising number were eager to tell their stories once they knew they wouldn't be alone. We met at my bakery late at night, after the ovens were turned off, and the place smelled of sugar and cinnamon. We sat at a small table, headphones in, listening to audio recordings of people recounting what he'd done to them. Some voices were steady, others shook with emotion. Each story added another layer to the truth I'd been carrying for years. When I began editing the video, I started exactly the way people would expect. Soft music, smiling photos of my father as a young man, clips of him shaking hands, cutting ribbons at opening, holding his retirement plaque. I wanted the first minute to be flawless, the kind of thing that would make a room full of people nod approvingly. Then I began weaving in the truth. The second minute slowed down. A narrator's voice, Laura's, began speaking over images of my father accepting a award. Behind the smile, behind the handshake, there were deals that destroyed lives. I overlaid photos of him with legal documents, his signature bold and unmistakable, while Laura read the stories. Each name was real, each account backed by proof. When I reached the Bennett family's eviction notice, I timed it so the image appeared just as a photo of my father laughing with a glass of champagne faded in. The contrast made my stomach twist, and I knew it would do the same to anyone watching. Every transition, every clip was deliberate. I wasn't just telling a story, I was dismantling a reputation. And I wanted the timing to sting, like a smile that turns into a slap. By the time I finished, the video was just under 8 minutes. The first half was celebration. The second half was the truth he'd buried for years. I sat back, watching it from start to finish. It was perfect, and when the gala came, he would never see it coming. A week before the gala, my phone lit up with my father's name. I stared at it for a second, debating whether to answer. He rarely called unless he wanted something, but curiosity won. "Emily," he said, his tone surprisingly warm. "I just wanted to say, it means the world that you're making this video for me. I know I haven't always said it, but it's nice to feel appreciated." For a moment, I almost believed him. A flicker of guilt nudged at me. Was I really about to humiliate my own father in front of everyone he respected? But then he chuckled and added, "Guess you finally found a way to be useful." The guilt evaporated instantly, replaced by the same cold determination I'd been carrying since the retirement dinner. "Glad you think so," I said evenly, and ended the call before he could say anything else. That Friday, we had a family dinner at my parents' house. It was supposed to be just the four of us, me, Dad, Mom, and Daniel, but it felt more like a stage play. Dad sat at the head of the table, sipping wine, tossing little comments my way about how Emily's really stepping up for the gala. Mom smiled politely, oblivious to the storm brewing. I kept my expression calm, almost cheerful. I knew if I acted even slightly irritated, he'd sense it and start poking for a reaction. Daniel kept watching me between bites, his brow furrowed. Halfway through the meal, he finally asked, "What's going on with you?" I pretended not to understand. "What do you mean? You've been different. Calm. It's like you're keeping a secret." I smiled faintly and set down my fork. "Maybe I am." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Emily, if this is about Dad's joke at the dinner." "It's not about the joke," I interrupted. "But you'll see soon enough." Daniel's frown deepened, but I didn't elaborate. Let him stew. He'd find out along with everyone else. And I wanted that moment to hit just as hard. The rest of dinner passed in polite conversation, but I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, weighing my every move. Dad, meanwhile, seemed entirely self-satisfied, already picturing his big night, his big send-off. He had no idea that the person making the biggest tribute was also the one holding the match. That night, back at my apartment, I sat on the couch with my laptop, watching the video one more time. Every clip, every word was exactly where it needed to be. The warm opening still made me want to roll my eyes, but it was necessary. The contrast would make the second half so much more devastating. A week from now, the lights would dim, the screen would flicker on, and my father would watch as the image he'd spent decades building cracked in front of an entire room. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The night of the gala, the hotel ballroom looked like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above rows of round tables draped in white linen. Tall vases of fresh flowers sat in the center of each table, surrounded by flickering candles. Waiters moved gracefully between guests with silver trays of champagne. In the corner, a string quartet played soft classical music, their notes weaving through the hum of conversation. I walked in wearing a deep green dress, one I knew brought out my eyes. Not for my father's benefit, he wouldn't notice, but because I wanted to look calm, unshaken, untouchable. The video was ready. The USB sat in my clutch, and I'd already confirmed with the AV tech that it would play exactly as planned. Richard was in his element. He stood near the stage, surrounded by a small crowd of old colleagues and clients, laughing like he owned the room. When he spotted me, he smiled in that way that wasn't really a smile. "Emily," he said, loud enough for his circle to hear, "try not to trip over the microphone when you present your little surprise." The people around him chuckled politely, though some looked uncomfortable. I just smiled and said, "Don't worry, Dad. I've got this." I took my seat at a table near the front, sipping champagne as the program began. Speeches were made, awards handed out, and praise was poured over my father like warm syrup. He soaked it up, occasionally glancing my way as if to remind me how adored he was. Finally, the MC stepped up to the microphone. "And now," he said with a bright smile, "we have a very special treat. A surprise from Richard's loving daughter, Emily Hayes, to honor his incredible career." I felt my pulse quicken, but outwardly I stayed still, my champagne glass in hand. Across the room, my father's chest puffed with pride. This was his moment, the one where I would, in his mind, publicly worship his legacy. The house lights dimmed. Conversations hushed. All eyes turned toward the massive projection screen hanging above the stage. The AV tech gave me a subtle thumbs up from his booth. The first image flickered to life, a black and white photo of my father in his 20s, smiling in front of his first office building. Soft piano music played. A ripple of warmth passed through the room as more images appeared. Him shaking hands, giving speeches, posing with awards. The crowd smiled, a few people nodding in admiration. I glanced at my father. He was beaming, soaking in every second. Good. Let him. Because in less than 60 seconds, the tone of the entire night was going to change. I leaned back in my chair, the glow from the screen lighting my face, and waited for the moment everything would turn. The video began exactly as I'd planned. Gentle piano music, warm lighting on the photos, and a perfectly timed sequence of moments that made my father look like a man anyone would admire. Childhood photos of him fishing with his dad, black and white snapshots from his early career, pictures of him in crisp suits standing beside smiling coworkers. The audience watched with soft smiles, a few people even clapping when a clip showed him receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. Richard leaned back in his chair, looking utterly satisfied. I could almost hear his thoughts. Finally, Emily's doing something right. Then, at exactly the 60-second mark, the music slowed. A faint static hum filled the speaker, and the next image was not a photo of a ribbon cutting or an award ceremony. It was a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local family loses home in controversial property deal." The Bennett family's picture was right there, their faces solemn. The piano stopped completely, replaced by Laura's steady voice over the speaker. Behind the smile, behind the handshake, was this. The next clip was a scanned legal document, Richard's bold signature at the bottom. Then came another, letters from the Bennetts, begging for more time, their words displayed in large text across the screen. Over the images, audio played of my father's voice, pulled from an old recording Laura had saved, brushing them off with cold detachment. "It's just business. If they can't keep up, it's not my problem." Gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," and the quiet murmur grew louder with each passing second. More documents flashed onto the screen, property maps, eviction notices, dated bank transfers, all timed to appear over photographs of Richard smiling at charity events and holding crystal awards. The contrast was jarring, and that was the point. I watched my father's expression shift. At first, confusion, then realization, then anger. His hands gripped the tablecloth as he stood abruptly. "Turn it off," he barked toward the AV booth. But the technician, who had seen the whole video in advance, didn't move. He kept his eyes on the screen, letting the footage play. Richard tried again, his voice louder this time. I said turn it off. He started toward the booth, but a few of his colleagues instinctively stepped in his way, not to stop him, but because they were glued to the screen themselves. Laura's voice continued, unwavering. For years, this man was celebrated as a pillar of the community. But for those who lost everything because of him, he was the reason they could no longer call a house a home. By the time the final image appeared, a photo of the Bennett's empty porch, the roses in front of it wilted and overgrown. The ballroom had gone silent except for the sound of my father's heavy breathing. 8 minutes had passed. And just like that, his spotless reputation was cracked wide open for everyone to see. When the screen went black, the silence in the ballroom was almost suffocating. No clinking glasses, no shuffling chairs, just a heavy stillness, as if the air itself had thickened. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed on my father. Richard cleared his throat, his face flushed deep red. This is nonsense," he said, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry. "Fabricated lies, taken out of context. You all know me. You know I'd never. But no one rushed to defend him. People exchanged glances, some leaning toward each other to whisper, others looking away entirely. A few stared at him with expressions I'd never seen directed at him before. Disappointment, even disgust. He tried again, more desperate this time. It's a setup. My own daughter. He stopped short, perhaps realizing that naming me would only confirm what everyone had just suspected. The truth was coming from inside his own family. I pushed back my chair and stood, my green dress catching the dim light. I didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his stammering. I simply walked toward the exit, heels clicking against the polished floor. The sound of my footsteps seemed to echo in the hush. No one stopped me. A few heads turned as I passed, but no one spoke. When I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, washing away the heat of the ballroom. I spotted Laura leaning against a stone column near the valet stand, her arms folded. She gave me a small nod, not a smile exactly, but something that said, "It's done." I joined her, taking a slow breath. "Well," I said quietly, "that's that." She looked at me for a moment before replying. "It's not over for him. Not by a long shot." We stood there in silence for a while, the muffled sounds of the gala seeping out whenever the doors opened, low voices, hurried footsteps, the clinking of glasses being cleared away. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out and saw Daniel's name on the screen. The text was short, sharp, and furious. "You just destroyed Dad." I stared at the words for a long moment. Once, that might have made me feel guilty, maybe even ashamed. But now, all I felt was clarity. I locked my phone without replying and slipped it back into my bag. There was nothing to say that would make Daniel understand. He hadn't been on the receiving end of Dad's cruelty. He hadn't watched his own father dismiss his work, his dreams, his worth. Inside, my father was probably scrambling to control the narrative, spinning half-truths to anyone who would listen. But the seed had been planted. People had seen the documents, heard the voices, and once that kind of truth takes root, it's hard to dig out. Laura straightened, glancing at me. "Ready to go?" "Yeah," I said, stepping toward the street. Let him deal with the silence for once. Weeks passed, and the ripples from the gala never stopped spreading. The story about the Bennetts, and the other families my father had wronged, circulated quietly at first, whispered in business circles, shared over coffee between old colleagues. Then it started showing up in local news columns. The company he'd given decades to released a short, polished statement thanking him for his years of service, while making it clear they no longer had any formal association with it. I didn't seek out updates, but they found me anyway. Customers at my bakery mentioned overhearing things. A friend sent me a link to a community forum where people debated whether the gala video had been too harsh or long overdue. I didn't comment, didn't correct anyone. I'd said what I needed to say, and the rest would take care of itself. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, I was behind the counter, piping pale pink frosting onto a batch of cupcakes for a bridal order. The bakery smelled like vanilla and buttercream, the kind of warm sweetness that used to make me wish my father could see my work for what it was. Now, I didn't care if he ever did. The bell over the door jingled, and I looked up to see Daniel striding in. His tie was crooked, his face tense. He didn't even glance at the display case. He came straight to the counter. "We need to talk," he said. I set the piping bag down, wiping my hands on a cloth. "About what?" "You know what?" he shot back. "Dad's barely leaving the house. People he's known for years won't return his calls. You humiliated him in front of everyone. You ruined our family." I held his gaze, feeling that familiar heaviness he was trying to hand to me. I didn't take it this time. "I didn't ruin anything, Daniel," I said evenly. "I just showed them who he's been all along." He blinked, caught off guard by my calm. "You think that makes it okay?" "I think the truth is always okay," I replied. "Whether people like it or not, that's their problem." For a moment, it looked like he might say more, but instead he shook his head in frustration. "You're unbelievable," he muttered, turning toward the door. The bell jingled again as it closed behind him, leaving the bakery quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator case. I walked over to the door, flipped the sign to closed, and slid the lock into place. Then I leaned back against it, letting out a long, slow breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. The air felt lighter. The space felt like mine in a way it hadn't before. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't carrying his weight, his judgment, or his secret. This time, the shame was his to carry. What about you? Do you think Emily was right to expose her father for what he'd done, or should she have kept the peace for the sake of family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd really love to hear them. And if you enjoy powerful stories like this, make sure you hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you're always in the loop.